So this is a video to revise education. So the first thing is the role of education. So like what is the purpose of going to school? Like how does it benefit our society by having the type of education system that we have? So the spec lists three kind of general roles of the education system. So firstly, serving the needs of the economy, so basically making sure that we have workers that have the correct skills that are going to help boost our economy, ensure that we've got the workforce that we need to ensure that all different sectors of the economy, different jobs in society can be filled by the most talented people that can fulfill those roles. Then we've got support social mobility. So social mobility is the idea that people can be born into poverty or born into working class families, but then by going through the education system, they can then become qualified to do middle class jobs. So it facilitates the process of moving up the social stratification system. And then we've got creating social cohesion. So this is a functionalist concept, and it's the idea that members of society are part of a community. So they are kind of like glued together. They're stuck together. They feel a sense of bond towards each other, and all members are in kind of agreement. So it's this idea of like value consensus. We all agree on the same thing. We feel a sense of community, a sense of social solidarity, as well as cohesion. Then the functionalist, sorry, I don't know if you can hear in the background, my dog is just having the longest drink ever. So the functionalist argument, so there are three different elements that you can talk about. So Durkheim, the founder of functionalism, talks about the role of education being to serve the needs of the economy, and he specifically refers to specialist skills. So at school you learn kind of numeracy, literacy, IT skills, etc., that are required to ensure that we have a skilled workforce. Secondly, Parsons talks about meritocracy. So again, this idea of supporting social mobility, but he talks about being socialised into two values, so equality and hard work. So we're taught that if we work hard, we will be successful, and that everyone has an equal opportunity to be successful. And then also you can link that to Davis and Moore, who talk about role allocation. So this idea that the education system kind of sifts and sorts people into the best role for their ability. So through the qualifications that you receive, it will kind of determine whether you can go on to sixth form, whether you can go on to university, whether you can then do further training in particular postgraduate programs, etc. And then it means that all of the people in our society can be assessed for what type of job they can apply for, and then it makes sure that we have the right people doing those jobs. And ultimately, the people who've worked the hardest and are the most talented will get the bigger rewards. And the final functionalist argument, again, is Parsons, and it's this idea of secondary socialisation. So the education system or the school acts as a bridge between the family and the workplace. So at home, individuals are subjected to what are called particularistic standards. So that means that they are individual or specific to their family. So there might be different rules in different households in terms of what behaviours are accepted, in terms of what sanctions will be given. So like what time your curfew is, and if you break your curfew, whether you get grounded or whether you get your phone confiscated or whatever. But the idea is that the school system treats everybody in the same way, so that when they go into the workplace or into wider society, they understand that the same rules apply to everybody. Nobody is above the law. Everybody will receive the same punishment for the same crime. Is the idea, and also the punishments are kind of staggered through the education system. So in terms of the severity of the punishment will increase and there'll be several warnings before, whereas in the workplace you don't really get warnings as such. You can just get fired instantly, rather than the process of school where lots of different interventions would be put in place before someone would be excluded. So essentially, the process is teaching people the norms and values of society, and it's an agency of social control that ensures that there's no enemy in society. Everyone is following the correct norms and values. The Marxist view, so Bowles and Gintis are the main sociologists for this one, and they put forward the correspondence theory. So this is the idea that what happens in school mirrors the workplace. So there are different examples, and the purpose of what they're saying is that when you go to work, you will be ready to accept the kind of exploitation and the treatment that the proletariat would receive in a capitalist society, because you would have been conditioned to experience that through your time at school. So one example that you can use is the idea of hierarchy. So in the school there's a hierarchy: head teacher, deputy heads, SLT, middle leaders, heads of year, head of department, then the teachers, then the students. And then we are very used to this concept of hierarchy, so then when we go to the workplace, we automatically respect authority, which benefits the capitalist system. A second point that they make is the idea of, through the hidden curriculum, we learn to become obedient workers. So one of the ways that this is achieved is through sanctions. So if we're late to school, we get a detention. That teaches us, by the time we get to the workplace, we know we shouldn't be late to work because we've been punished several times before for doing that, so we've learned not to do it anymore, which obviously benefits the capitalist system because they will have punctual, obedient workers that don't break the rules. And then the final thing, you can talk about alienation. So you can talk about how school's boring, repetitive, you have little control over what you learn, etc. So then when you get to the workplace, you're prepared for boring work that's repetitive and you don't have any control over what you do. Or you can talk about this one, so the myth of meritocracy. So this is the idea that meritocracy, that Parsons talks about, is actually a myth, as in it doesn't really exist, but we are taught to believe that it does. So we believe our society is meritocratic. That's what we're taught. We're taught constantly, you're taught constantly at school, if you work hard, you'll get good GCSE results, blah, 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 blah. You're taught that everyone has an equal chance of being successful. It's all down to the individual and how hard they work. And if we're taught that and we believe that, when we get our job in future society, we don't challenge the system. So we think that the people in charge of us in the workplace worked harder than us at school. We think they deserve that position. We think, oh, well, they must have higher qualifications, so therefore they must be more talented than me. So then we don't disrupt the hierarchy, we don't challenge the people above us, because we think that the positions that we've all been given are fair, they were fairly allocated. So this is very similar to this point here that Davison, Moore and Parsons are making. The difference is we're saying that this actually is all a conspiracy. The whole thing is there to keep the proletariat in line. So it is an unequal system, it's deceiving us, and it helps the bourgeoisie maintain their position because we are blinded by our false class consciousness, so we submit to the system. Finally, also for Marxism as well, another point you could make is the official curriculum. So the official curriculum teaches us that communism fails, so things like the fall of Soviet Russia, or issues in terms of communist leadership, so Cambodia, etc. So those examples of how communism has failed in other countries, and then we think, oh, we don't want to have that system. Then the feminist argument. So you just need 3 different points to say that the role of the education system is to perpetuate patriarchal inequalities. So one way is through the hidden curriculum, and you can give an example more specifically of teacher expectations. So the idea that teachers pay more attention to boys, girls are expected to be quiet and get on with their work, whereas boys are given more praise, more encouragement, etc. from teachers. If a teacher's looking for a leader of a group or someone to help them do, I don't know, carry the folders to another classroom, etc., then they're going to ask the boys to do that, and that just reinforces male superiority. Gender socialization at school, so the idea that different genders are pushed into different subjects. So girls do have social care, so then you can become a nurse or a childcare worker, etc. Boys are more pushed into the STEM subjects. You could also link in textbook images here. So the males in science textbook, you've always got the female nurse and the male doctor, blah, 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 blah. And then that also affects the career choices or gender roles in the future. So as in women choosing to be housewives rather than having a career. And then finally, you can refer to teachers. So 75% of teachers are female, but only 40% of head teachers are female. So reinforcing the glass ceiling or patriarchal inequalities within the workplace. Actually, another sociologist says the idea of like female teachers sometimes get male teachers to come in and like shout at their class for them, etc. I mean, I definitely don't think that happens in our school, but yeah, that's something that sociologists have said. So the idea that it's like female damsel in distress and then males come to the rescue on their behalf. Processes within schools. So the spec specifically refers to that, and when they're talking about that, they are referring to usually things to do with teachers, and it tends to be the interactionist perspective, but not always. So just so we're clear, the interactionist views are labelling and self-fulfilling prophecy. So teachers do the labelling, so they stereotype pupils and they treat them differently because of the stereotypes that they hold. And in terms of examples, you might say that the pupils they label the labels that they would attach to pupils could be like hardworking or lazy or more intelligent, more focused, more enthusiastic about learning, etc., or less engaged with learning or disruptive, etc. So they're the types of labels, and they're based on stereotypes to do with class, gender, or ethnicity usually. And the key is that the teacher treats them differently because of those labels, and that further kind of actions from the pupil wouldn't change the label that they have. And then that can lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy, so where the pupil lives up to the label. The opposite of a self-fulfilling prophecy is called a self-negating prophecy, and that's when the pupil rejects the label. So that would work often as an evaluation point, is that you can reject or negate the label you've been given and work harder to disprove your teacher's perception of you. And then also interactionists would then say how this leads to the master status, and it leads so other pupils in the class would view you that way, and then also then it might lead you to forming anti-school subcultures. So if a teacher labels you as disruptive, other people in the class might view you as disruptive and not want to be friends with you, so then you have to seek out other deviants to become friends with so you can gain status off of them, because you're not going to get it in the legitimate way. Types of groupings, so you just need to know what the 3 different types are. So mixed ability, so I mean it's literally what it says, so it's the idea you're in a class with people and there could be all different levels of intelligence or aptitude for that specific subject in the room. So our sociology class is mixed ability, and that means that everybody can be performing at different levels. Some people can be amazing at the subject and get 9s, and then some people might be, struggling to pass. So it's like a variety across the spectrum within the same class. In terms of sets, this is the idea that you're put in a specific class based on your ability for that subject, that individual subject. So you could be in the top set for English, but then that doesn't mean that you would be in the top set for maths. You could be in the top set for English, but then the bottom set for maths. So it's like it recognises that you could have talents for certain subjects or enjoy certain subjects more, so you work harder in them, but then that might not reflect your performance in other subjects. Whereas streaming is the idea that your general intelligence, your general competence and ability in education means that you're put in the top stream. So then you would be in the highest group for all of your subjects. So if we don't have a streaming system, but if we did, it would mean your general intelligence, your IQ, would be measured, and then you would be put in, for example, the top set for maths, English and science and RE, and then or the middle set for all of them, or the bottom set for all of them. So that can be problematic because obviously you might be particularly strong at one subject but not the others, so then that might mean that you might still end up being in the bottom stream even though you're really good at maths or something like that, because it's based on your general overarching ability. So that can have limits. And then you're kind of asked to just think of strengths and weaknesses. So generally, the idea is that in mixed ability classes, it's helpful because like lower ability pupils can learn from the higher ability. They can be motivated by them. The idea that people can share ideas and have different strengths in the room. Then the weakness of mixed ability is more that some people are kind of held back because there's slower paced people in the room, or the teacher can't really teach to their 8s and 9s if there's lots of people in the room that are getting 3s and 4s. Whereas if there was a setting system, then it allows the teacher to stretch the top and then really break it down for the lower ability. So the strengths to setting and streaming would be that you're kind of in a class of people that are at your ability. It helps the teacher facilitate the kind of appropriate level of progress for the group. But then the weakness is obviously is if you're in a lower setting stream, then you're demotivated. You feel that you've been labelled. Sometimes pupils might be underperforming quite significantly in like year 8, year 9, but then can make a lot of progress in year 10, but teachers might have already kind of made the decision on the sets, and then it might be quite difficult to change the sets later on. So then that becomes problematic in terms of the late bloomers academically. Key studies, so the first one is Willis. So Paul Willis is a Marxist, so he did an ethnography, so like a long-term qualitative study, so like observations and interviews in a school, I want to say in Birmingham. I think it was in Birmingham, but I could be wrong, so don't quote me. And he interviewed and observed the behaviour of what the group that were called the lads, and he argued that they saw through the myth of meritocracy. So they could see that the education system was rigged against them. They could see that because they were working class, they were never going to be successful. They were never going to gain respect of middle class teachers. The system, even if they did well at school, they weren't going to be able to afford to go to university. They were never going to get good jobs. So they kind of rejected the whole system and created counter school subcultures that actively resisted and subverted, so like reversed the norms and values of the school. So they were rude to teachers, they bunked lessons, they were disruptive in the lessons they were in, they didn't do their homework, etc. And then ultimately, because they did all of those things, they still failed in education and still ended up in a working class job, but in manual work. But the kind of point was that they knew they were never going to be successful. Ball is an interactionist. So teachers had lower expectations of pupils who were in the lower sets and streams, and that kind of resulted in a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the pupils felt demotivated and then became less successful as a result. On the contrast, the higher sets had pupils that were more motivated because the teachers had higher expectations of them, and then this kind of led to a bit of a polarization in terms of the motivation levels and the achievement levels. So the higher sets were becoming better and better, and the lower sets were becoming worse and worse. And then Ball also says that teacher labels in terms of social class can result in the middle class being placed in higher sets and the working class placed in lower sets. Okay, so differential achievement. So this is to do with which groups statistically outperform other groups, basically. So the key studies, Ball, so it's the same Ball, but this point he's making isn't really interactionist. This is just, if anything, Marxist, but yeah. He's basically saying, so just, I wouldn't specify the theory here, but he is saying that league tables only benefit the middle class, and this idea of parental choice, so that education system allowing parents to have more choice in terms of which schools they apply to and send their children to, only really benefits the middle class. And we end up, he's very critical of the marketization of education, which I'll go through later, because he believes that the middle class benefit more from that, because the oversubscribed schools, so the more popular schools, will select all the middle class pupils because they believe that they're going to do better. So then we end up where middle class have a further advantage in education. I can talk about that more when we get to the education reform section. But basically, he's arguing that the middle class have an advantage in the education system because the parents are more involved in the school selection process, looking at league tables, etc. And then Halsey is a Marxist. He's the one who did the longitudinal study, where he looked at children of men in different professions, and then he looked at what age they dropped out of education, and he found that social class does affect how long people stay in education, and that children of professionals were 11 times more likely to go to university. So essentially, middle class or higher class parents means you're more likely to stay in school. Working class, manual jobs, etc., you're more likely to drop out at an earlier age. Okay, this is a lot. So, differential achievement, you need to know which groups do well in education and which groups underperform. And obviously, the statistics kind of change every year, but generally, the trends, we've got girls outperform boys by about 10%. The gender gap is closing, but girls do still quite significantly outperform boys. Then we've got middle class and working class. So middle class, again, significantly outperform working class. So in terms of being more likely to stay on at university, you can use the stat from Halsey, 11 times more likely. Actually, he did his study quite a long time ago. It's about 8 times more likely now, but it's still a significant difference. And the gap in the pupils that achieve 5 GCSE passes, you've got about 80% of the middle class get 5 GCSE passes compared to only 35% of pupils on free school meals. So there's a significant disparity in achievement there. And then in terms of ethnic groups, so the highest performing ethnic groups are Indian and Chinese, with over 75% achieving 5 GCSE passes, compared to underperforming ethnic groups. So the lowest performing ethnic group in the education system, if you consider class and gender, is actually white working class boys. And some of the points work for that. So like negative labelling, anti-school subcultures can explain why white working class boys underachieve. But then some of the points, if we're talking about ethnocentrism or institutional racism, etc., we need to refer to other ethnic groups. So Black Caribbean boys tend to underachieve. Only around 35% get 5 GCSE passes. And you can also refer to Pakistani, Bangladeshi pupils from other black backgrounds. I couldn't get my words out then. You can say underperform in relation to other ethnic groups. And also the white majority, if we're thinking about middle class white people or girls as well, who kind of pull up the white stats more. Okay, so generally in differential achievement, when you're asked about this concept, you generally need to say how so if it was about gender, you would have to say like why the girls do well and why the boys underperform in the same paragraph. So like this here is one paragraph, this is another paragraph, this is another paragraph. So in each paragraph, you should be referring to a group that do well and a group that underperform, because you're explaining the differential achievement, so the difference, like why are they achieving different things. So you need to say why some are advantaged and why some are disadvantaged, and try and use a key term for each. The other key thing to look out for is what's the question asking? Is it asking for internal factors, so in-school factors, or is it asking for external factors, so things to do with the home? Okay, so let's just go through each one. So reasons girls do well, so positive labelling, so teachers view girls as more hardworking, and then they might live up to that label, self-fulfilling prophecy, do well. They might form pro-school subcultures, so that's friendship groups that their norms and values kind of benefit their educational achievement. So they want to succeed, they might compete with each other to get the highest grade on a test, they might spend their break time going to the library, doing extra homework, etc. And then teacher role models, as we've said before, 75% of teachers are female, providing role models. Obviously, don't mention the head thing here because the point is that girls do better, so all of your points need to support why girls do better. And then for boys underperforming, we've got boys are negatively labelled as less motivated, etc., lazier, and then that can become their master status. They live up to the label. They're more likely to form anti-school subcultures, and you could use Cohen for that, you could use Willis to support that. And also the lack of teacher role models, so they might view education as less less fitting for their gender. It's not a norm for their gender for them to do well in education. It's more girly and feminine. And then for external factors, this idea of bedroom culture, so girls are encouraged to spend time in their bedroom revising so they get good grades, whereas boys experience a lack of social control by parents, so they're allowed to spend more time outside playing football with their friends, etc. So then that means that their grades will suffer. gender socialization, so parental expectations are that girls will do well, girls will be well behaved at school, get good school reports, etc., whereas parents would have lower expectations for their sons and be less kind of bothered if their sons were underachieving or getting bad reports. And then the rise of feminism versus crisis of masculinity. So girls have got increasing opportunities in the workplace, increasing goals and visions for our future. We've got more kind of successful role models to look up to in the media. Whereas boys are experiencing a crisis in masculinity. So in the past, boys knew that they would be the most successful in the workplace. They knew they had to be the breadwinner and provide for a family, and if they were going to get married in the future, then that would be their selling point almost. Whereas now, as women are becoming increasingly successful in the workplace and we're outperforming males in education, that's leading to them viewing their future prospects with quite a fatalistic attitude. They're not optimistic about the opportunities that they have. They view increasing unemployment, particularly for working class boys, when they're seeing the amount of manual jobs that are in decline and unemployment increasing, etc. So they're not viewing education as something that is going to help them get to where they want to be anymore. Okay, for social class then, middle class do well due to labelling. So teachers label them positively as more intelligent, maybe having more parental support at home, maybe having higher aspirations, whereas working class are negatively labelled as maybe being more fatalistic, having immediate gratification, or labelled as less aspirations in terms of their future. Leads to a self-fulfilling prophecy and can explain the differences in their achievement. And then another interactionist point, or actually you could say interactionist, or you could use Cohen again, which would be a functionalist point, or Willis, which would be an interactionist point. So any of those theories you could use for subcultures. Middle class pro-school, working class anti-school, obviously whichever one they join facilitates either their progress or their educational failure. And then you can use Ball to talk about sets and streaming. So middle class placed in the higher sets, working class placed in the lower sets, and then the teacher expectations fit that accordingly, resulting in the polarisation of their achievement. Economic capital is a Marxist point. So they're saying that the middle class are advantaged because they have more money. So they can use that money to buy resources, to buy tutors, to send their children to private schools, etc. So they will do better in education, whereas another Marxist point is that the working class experience material deprivation, so they're less able to buy those resources. And then even though they might be attending a school where they don't have to pay for the actual attendance to school, they might still need to buy a laptop or a textbook, etc. And if they can't afford that, that can inhibit their progress. Here we've got cultural capital and cultural deprivation. So cultural capital is a Marxist perspective because it's saying that the middle class are advantaged, whereas cultural deprivation is a functionalist view because it's blaming the working class. So the key thing to look for is if the point feels sorry for the working class, aka material deprivation, then it's Marxist. If it's blaming the working class, then it's functionalist, so cultural deprivation. So the middle class do well due to cultural capital, so parents socialise their children into the norms, values, skills, pass on the knowledge that's going to help them access the curriculum, so for example taking them to museums. And this has nothing to do with money, so it's all to do with the values, like reading to their children. And obviously that can be free. You can get books for free from the library, you can go to museums for free. There's nothing to do with money in the point here. And then the working class parents can culturally deprive their children, so they're less able to access the curriculum. So if they're not used to reading at home, then obviously they might find it more difficult to do that in school. They might not have the language in terms of like sophisticated vocabulary, not in terms of English, to access the curriculum. Also, actually, here I should have added this, for working class, you can include immediate gratification, so wanting instant rewards. So I'll just spend my Friday night out with my friends or watching Netflix rather than revising for my test that I've got on Monday. Whereas middle class have delayed gratification or deferred gratification. So the idea that they would put the hard work in now and then celebrate in the summer once they've got amazing GCSE results. And then parentocracy is, think of it like meritocracy, but based on your parents' work. So how hard your parents work helps you in education. Sorry, I'm just having a drink. Ooh, fizzy. Sorry, parentocracy. So middle class have high levels of parentocracy. Their parents are more involved in their educational journey. So that can be in terms of communicating with teachers about progress. It can be in terms of checking like their homework, what they have got set on Firefly, making sure they're doing their homework, helping them with it if they're struggling. It can also be to do with um, applications to their best school in the borough. So making sure that they've read the Ofsted reports, they've looked at the league tables, and they're considering like which school would be the best for their child to go to. Whereas the working class have a lack of parentocracy, so the parents may be more interested in them going to the closest school, for example, to save on transport costs or something like that, or be less culturally aware in terms of how to read the Ofsted report, etc. Also, parents may be less involved, so it could be to do with like the shifts that their parents work. They might not be able to attend parents' evening, things like that. Or it could just be like parents, if they're working class, may not value education, as it's likely that they underperformed in education due to their job as well. So lots of different things you could bring in there, but just, pick one and go with it. Okay, in terms of ethnic groups, so positive labelling, so here we're talking specifically Chinese, Indian are more likely to be positively labelled by teachers. They stereotypically view them as being more hardworking. Possibly you could say the teacher might make assumptions that they're going to be more intelligent, more able at the subject, etc. And that leads to them performing more highly. And then negative labelling, you could refer to like Black Caribbean boys, or even in this case, depending on what the question says, you could refer to white working class boys. But just be careful, because sometimes the question might say ethnic minority groups may underperform in relation to a white majority. And then that's the other key thing, is be careful, because obviously then when you're saying ethnic minority, specify which ethnic groups are underperforming in relation to white people, because obviously Indian and Chinese do significantly better than white people and would still be an ethnic minority in terms of the proportions within the UK. So just be careful in terms of your phrasing. Another thing people often do is say ethnic people. There's no such thing. I'm white, I still have an ethnicity. So like, just by saying ethnic person, like, doesn't make sense. So just specify the ethnicity. And if you're meaning someone who's not white, then you can say ethnic minority, just because the vast majority, about 80% of the UK, are white. So that's where the term minority comes from in that respect. Pro-school I can't speak now. Pro-school subcultures and anti-school subcultures. So high-performing ethnic groups are more likely to be in the pro-school ones. So yeah, going to the library at lunchtime, that vibe. And then anti-school, bunking lessons, rude to teachers, etc. And then in terms of the curriculum, you can argue, I mean, the main focus really is the ethnocentric curriculum. And it's always a bit of a dodgy point to make because obviously the curriculum's so whitewashed that there isn't really curriculum role models reflecting Indian or basically any other ethnic group, even the ones that are outperforming white people. But that might not necessarily fit the essay. So as long as you're just saying that some ethnic groups, and you can say particularly black pupils, are disadvantaged by this because when their history is studied, it's often in a negative way. So looking at things like people being enslaved, etc. So obviously that is a negative experience in education, and in terms of having role models, etc. A lot, well, all other ethnic groups are pretty much absent from so much of the curriculum. So your point is that it leads to specific groups feeling marginalised, feeling like demotivated, and then kind of not wanting to cooperate necessarily with education, or like viewing it as something that they might not succeed in, etc. Or maybe just finding it less interesting because it's not something that they feel represented in. And then in terms of out of school factors, you can use economic capital and material deprivation again. So you can say that like Indian and Chinese tend to be the most wealthy ethnic groups as well. So their parents are more likely to be able to put money into their education, whereas the groups that underperform, so Black, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, etc., are more likely to experience material deprivation because, and you could argue that because of the racism they've experienced or the barriers that they face, they're more likely to be in poverty as well. So their children will suffer as a result. Cultural capital versus cultural deprivation. So the idea of the norms and values that the parents pass down. So parents being more passing down the value of education, seeing it as something that's important, taking them to museums, etc. Whereas parents that may lack value for education or not see it as kind of the only way to success, etc., not passing on the values that or skills that are going to help their children succeed. Parentocracy, so parents being more involved in the educational journey, helping their child get into the best school, etc. And then lack of parentocracy, and in this case you can say language barriers could be an issue for some parents. So if the parents don't speak English, they're not going to be able to help their children with the homework. They might not be able to communicate with teachers to find out like if their child is underperforming or not meeting deadlines, etc. Obviously reading Ofsted reports would be problematic. They also, if they went to school in a different country, they might not be familiar with the British education system. So it's like, again, lots of barriers that might limit the chances of success for certain pupils. Educational reform. So this is all to do with educational policies. So anything to do with reform, you automatically think it's to do with the government and what the government are doing to improve or failing to do to improve the education system. So the marketisation of education is basically that schools and the education system has become an education market. So it's become like the world of business. So schools are literally marketed in the same way that businesses are, and they're competing for customers, and the customers are the pupils. And they do that through like open evenings or prospectuses, adverts that you see on like buses and the tube for certain schools, that kind of thing. And the reason that the Conservative or New Right government brought this in is because they think that competition increases standards. So in a market, if you were selling a product and no one was buying it, you'd have to make a better product. It's the same principle here. If no one's coming to your school, you have to make your school better to get more customers, to get more pupils. Also, it supports this idea of parentocracy, so essentially there's more information available to parents so they can read all the prospectuses, they can go to all the open evenings, they can find out more about the school to make the best choice for their children. The problems is that it becomes a fight for funding, so essentially teachers just want, well, not teachers, schools want to get more pupils in just to get more money. So the more pupils you have, the more money you get, and then that becomes the main priority. And then also, so the priority becomes recruitment, so you're just trying to get pupils in, but also the spending goes on recruitment. So think how much it must cost to print all the prospectuses for prospective children, or the flyers that go out, that kind of thing, especially schools that advertise in the media, etc. It costs a lot of money to do that, and that could be spent on the pupils that are in the classroom. League tables. So again, competition increases standards. If you're low in the league tables, you need to get better results to improve your position. Everybody wants to be at the top of the league table. But it supports parentocracy as well, because parents can get more information. They can look at the league table for their borough and see like where the different schools are ranked and decide whether which ones they're going to apply to. The problem with this is that selection policies are then introduced and they can discriminate against certain groups. And sociologists have referred to this as cream skimming. So cream skimming is like an analogy from a coffee cup. So if you think of whatever, is it a frappuccino? I don't know. The blended one, not the cream one, just the coffee one from Starbucks. The best part, apparently, is the cream. So the idea is that you just skim the cream off the top. So if you think about the coffee cup being filled with all the applicants to the school, and then the school just pulls the cream off the top. We just want the best ones. We don't want all the coffee in the bottom. We just want the cream at the top. So essentially, if your school's oversubscribed, you've got 1,000 applicants and 500 places, you can pick all the ones that you think are going to do well. So essentially, the middle class pupils, the ones that have got postcodes in expensive areas, the ones that have got girls. Generally, higher performing schools have higher levels of girls just because they select them because they think they will do better. And then that results in what we kind of refer to as a two-tiered system, which is the idea that all the oversubscribed schools select the best pupils, but then everyone else has to go somewhere, so then they go to the schools lower in the league tables. So then you've got advantaged groups going to the best schools, and then disadvantaged groups going to the worst schools, so you end up with a polarisation of achievement again, and social inequalities being reproduced. Stress on teachers, so obviously there's huge amount of pressure placed on teachers to get good results, and then obviously that stress is translated onto pupils because teachers are, constantly displacing their stress on the pupils to try and get them to do better. And intervention can become very selective, so the idea, if you've got pupils in your class that you think going to fail the subject, you just think there's no point intervening with those children because the league tables is looking at grades 4 and upwards. So if someone's only ever going to achieve a 2, then teachers might think there's no point, they're a lost cause, and that obviously isn't okay. So it's the idea that teachers become a bit selective about who they do revision with because they're too bothered about making sure that they get everyone to get a 4, or the other key grade is a 7, like the 7 to 9. So anyone who's getting like a 6, let's intervene with them to get them into the 7. Ofsted, so obviously increases standards. So in terms of, it's a government-led organisation that investigates schools, inspects schools, and sees how they kind of perform in relation to a variety of different standards, so safeguarding, behaviour, teaching and learning, other provision in terms of like careers, UCAS support, enrichment, etc. And obviously they give guidance, and that's a good thing because schools can look at the guidance and they can learn how to get better. Then when the inspectors come in, they can give further advice to schools to make them improve, so that's positive. Again, it supports parentocracy because parents can read the Ofsted reports and find out if it's the right school for their children. And this was also part of Thatcher's, was it Thatcher? Yeah, it was Conservative government as well, so the top policies are all about conservative marketisation of education. Sports parentocracy. Not a valid assessment, so obviously they only come in for 2 days, so it's not valid. The idea obviously depends who the inspectors go and see. It depends what the pupils say. People don't act naturally in both ways. People can freak out and do badly when they would normally do well, or people can, be fake better than they are. So schools can be under or over graded based on the 2 days that they're there. Obviously, high levels of stress on schools. And then also Ball talks about like middle class parents only middle class parents looking at league tables. We've got the idea that only middle class parents read the Ofsted reports as well. Generalisation, of course. National curriculum. So this was the idea that all content was standardised. So there were certain topics that children had to cover up until they started their GCSE, when you start following the GCSE syllabus. But through primary school and Key Stage 3, you would follow the national curriculum. And this benefited boys and girls because it was the idea that girls now studied the same subjects. Well, it benefited girls, sorry, not boys and girls, because it's the idea that boys and girls then studied the same subjects, so they had the same career opportunities. Because prior to the national curriculum, girls would do like home economics and typing lessons because they were seen to be housewives or secretaries, so they were the only two things they needed to know how to do. National curriculum, criticisms is ethnocentric, so whitewashed curriculum that's not inclusive. Not all schools follow it, so you only have to follow it if you are a comprehensive school. Lots of other types of schools, which we'll look at in a second, don't follow the national curriculum, so it's not like a significant policy. And then thirdly, one size does not fit all. So essentially teaching all pupils across the country the same curriculum, it's not tailored, to their specific needs or the demographic maybe of the school. So you might look at our school and you might look at the ethnic makeup of the school and think, actually, do we need to spend all of our history lessons looking at kind of the history of Britain or white history? Can we look at the history of, East Africa or something like that? So you might pick a specific unit that you might want to study based on the ethnic groups that are represented in your school. But you can't do that if you follow the national curriculum. Public examinations, so as in tests that you sit, so they could be assessments like SATs, or they could be the actual examinations that you do like GCSEs and A-levels. Strengths of having those: allows for role allocation, so obviously the whole reason that you get a grade is because you need to be ranked in terms of how able you are in that specific subject. So we need people to get A's or 9s to show that they are particularly talented in the subject, and then obviously the people that get lower grades than that, it reflects their ability in the subject. Then we can determine like what A levels or degree, etc. they can be accepted into. And then also assesses progress, so it's important in terms of like regulating schools, or like people use the data from SATs to determine sets. Ofsted look at examination results, because obviously if a school's getting terrible results, then obviously something isn't going right. If a school's getting fantastic results, then obviously you don't get great outcomes without doing things right. So it helps schools be monitored. Problem: high levels of stress, obviously, particularly more for pupils. Obviously, the grade aspect does affect teachers as well, but obviously I would say the main issue here is the pupils. Exams are very stressful. You do a significant amount of work for a long time to be assessed on one day, and that is very stressful. Not all pupils perform well in this type of assessment, so written examinations generally are not always the best way to assess pupils. Pupils can be very good at a subject, but just not be able to perform in that type of environment or assessment criteria form. So it's biased towards kind of the more academic pupils, or just people who do well in that type of situation. The final policy is vocationalism. So these are skills that help you in the workforce, so things like ICT or numeracy skills. Strengths: we have a skilled workforce, and also that we're prepared for the working environment. So the first one's like the skills, we have the correct abilities, but also we're prepared for the actual working environment. So in terms of like what the day-to-day tasks would be, or what the routines are in a workplace, the kind of ways to speak to different members of staff, etc. Problems: 2/3 of companies believe that pupils are not actually well prepared for work, so clearly vocational education isn't working, there's not enough of it. And then also they are lower status qualifications generally across society. There's this view that they're not as prestigious for some reason than other types of qualifications. So people view them as like a lower qualification. So people often view BTECs as not as desirable as A-levels, for example, when really they're the exact same level of qualification, which is very sad. Okay, last thing, types of schools, and I've just realised that I've missed off on my slides the tripartite system, so I'm just going to quickly explain it. So the tripartite system used to exist, and it was a system where you took an exam when you were in year 6 called the 11 plus exam, and it determined which type of school you went to. So there were technical schools for pupils to do vocational subjects. There were grammar schools for pupils that were particularly academic, who performed well on the 11 plus test. And then there were secondary modern, which was basically everybody else. So you went to the grammar schools if you were particularly intelligent, technical schools if you performed quite lowly on the test and would be better suited to vocational skill based education. And then secondary modern was for everybody else. And the system was basically abolished because it resulted in all the middle class pupils getting tutors to help them pass the 11 plus exam, and then everybody that was in grammar schools pretty much was middle class. So I think it was about 6% of pupils from working class background actually got into 6% of grammar schools. 6% of pupils at grammar schools were working class. So it was a massive divide in terms of social class. So they got rid of the system to make it more fair. Also, they realise, again, huge amounts of pressure on pupils aged 10 to perform on a one-day exam. And also, does your ability at 10 years old actually reflect your potential for your success at GCSE, etc. So they got rid of the tripartite system. And then these are the types of schools that you need to know about. So comprehensive schools, sometimes known as state schools, so they're government funded and they are non-selective and they follow the national curriculum. So they're non-selective, so everybody can attend, so there's no entrance exam, there's no payment required, there's no specific type of pupil that can go there, and the education is free, so it's funded by the government. Disadvantages, it's government funded, so there's less money spent per pupil. Obviously, that is why teachers are striking at the moment, is because their budgets for schools are inadequate and obviously not enough money is being spent on you to ensure that you are getting the best education that you could have. And the national curriculum is taught in comprehensive schools, so that's not tailored to all pupils. Independent, so from here down, so independent, academies, free schools, special schools, none of those follow the national curriculum. So the same advantages and disadvantages in regards to the national curriculum would apply to all of these. So because they don't follow the national curriculum, they can tailor their curriculum to the pupils at their school. But the problem with them not following the national curriculum is that there's no like standardization in terms of what they're teaching pupils, so that pupils aren't getting like the required set knowledge that the government recommends that they cover. And also it can be problematic for pupils that move schools in like year 8 or something like that, because they wouldn't necessarily be following the same scheme of work. So that would apply to all of those below, other than comprehensive, because they do follow it. So independent schools, sometimes known as private schools, they are also called public schools. So be careful, because obviously the logical thing would be that public schools are comprehensive state schools, but they're not. So don't get confused. Don't refer to comprehensive as public. That would be incorrect. So independent or private, and they are what are called public schools. So obviously parents pay for children to go to these, so they're funded by parents. They are outside of government control, which is why they're independent, and then that also means that they don't have to follow the national curriculum. So high quality facilities, resources and teaching, so obviously there's way more money put into the school. Teachers are teaching on a much lower timetable to much smaller class sizes, etc. So that means that they are able to teach much better. There is also like the ability to do a lot more kind of extracurricular clubs, etc. in private schools, and also the results are much higher. Selective, based on payment, so that reinforces social class inequalities. So they're selective as in they only let you in if you can pay the fee. Sometimes you have to take an exam as well, but the key thing is the payment. And then obviously Marxists would say that that reproduces class inequalities, so only middle class can go. The other disadvantage you can say is the national curriculum is not taught there, so there's a lack of regulation in terms of the content that they teach. Academies. So academies are schools that are outside of government control, outside of local authority control. So they don't follow the national curriculum, but they do receive some funding from the government and also from businesses as well. So the strengths, business sponsor them, so they can have better quality facilities, resources, etc. A lot of academies, if you visited any, have like really nice buildings, really impressive like ICT suites, etc. Also, lots of feigning schools had been converted into academies as part of like academy trusts, where there's like a group of schools that work together. So that allows like for the network of schools to improve the performance, because teachers can get advice from other teachers, they can share resources, etc. Free to attend, and because they don't follow the national curriculum, they can adapt the curriculum to the pupils that they teach. However, they don't follow the national curriculum, so the content is not standardised or regulated. Because they're not controlled by the local authority, the schools can make up whatever rules they want, and that usually results in excessive teacher workload and kind of unrealistic expectations on teachers, and obviously that has a direct impact on the pupils, because if teachers have got too much work to do, then they can't put all of their investment into the pupils or do what they want to be able to have done for their pupils. Free schools, so they're called free schools because they are free from government control. So they are set up and run by parents. So set up and run by teachers and parents. So advantage, parents can set them up in an area with kind of inadequate schools. Curriculum can be adapted and tailored to the needs of the pupils. Problems, obviously parents may not be qualified, they may not make the best decisions if they don't have experience kind of within education or within running schools, so it might not be the best kind of management strategy to go with. Also, don't follow the national curriculum, so lack of regulation on content taught. Also, in terms of funding, they are free to go to, as in you don't have to pay, but that's not why they're called free schools. They're called free because they're free from control. And they are funded by the government. So they're not controlled by the government, they're controlled by the parents, but the parents apply to the government to get funding for the school. Special schools, so these are for pupils with high level needs that could be physical, developmental, mental health issues, etc. So children who have those needs may go to a separate school, and this could be beneficial for them because the staff will be better trained to meet the needs of those pupils. If they're in a class with 30 other pupils, then obviously the teacher has less time to cater to their individual needs, and also it could be problematic if the teacher doesn't have the training in terms of what those specific needs are. But in this type of school, they would get that better quality support. Also, the curriculum would be tailored to the pupils. So rather than if the need was developmental, for example, they might struggle to access certain parts of the curriculum, and this would be tailored to their needs in that way. Or if it was like a physical or mental health issue, then also like they may miss their attendance, might be impacted, etc. So that would also benefit them. Segregated from society, so obviously they might not be able to mix with pupils from the mainstream education system, and that can kind of lead them to feeling more segregated. Also, in terms of qualifications, often pupils that attended special schools have less qualifications, so it could be the idea that they may have like lower expectations in terms of what qualifications the pupils would be able to achieve, whereas obviously lots of different developmental issues or different types of neurodiversity can actually be a strength in so many subjects, or wouldn't actually affect your academic ability if you had some physical issues, but being in a special school might mean that the expectations could be lower, or the facilities in terms of you having that specific tutoring for those subjects may be limited because there may be less demand. Specialist schools, so these are schools that have a certain subject that they say they're a specialist in. So they say that their teachers are particularly have high levels of expertise in this area, or that they can offer more extracurricular clubs in that specific subject. So like if a school was a maths and science specialist, then the idea is that the science department and maths department are superior, or that there's more funding put into that subject, or that they offer more clubs, etc. And that's a strength because it can nurture talents in those specific subjects. The grades would be higher in those subjects, etc. Also, it's helpful for parents because if you knew a school was a specialist in a certain subject and you wanted that to be a subject that your child was going to focus on or had a specific talent in, then you might prioritise that school. However, no funding is received for it now, so in the past, the departments may have been able to do more extracurricular clubs or buy more resources, etc., for that subject because they had more funding for it, whereas now that funding shock has been removed. Also, limited variation in the content taught, so essentially just because you go to a school that teachers there's a maths and science specialist doesn't mean you do more maths and science, or just because you go to a drama school a school that's a specialist in drama doesn't necessarily mean that everyone has to do drama as a result. Finally, alternative provision. So alternative provision is something other than mainstream education as we know it. Deschooling is the idea of moving away from the traditional idea of school, but just focusing on the education element. So the idea that schools have become too focused on the hidden curriculum elements and the rules and the regulations and the hierarchies, etc. And we should be more focused on making pupils love learning again. So the strengths of deschooling, so teaching pupils in a more informal environment, means that they can focus on the love for learning, they will enjoy the learning more, and kind of benefit more from that. And then it would be a less oppressive system, so it wouldn't be kind of training us to be obedient workers for the capitalist system. We'd move away from schools being exam factories. There'd be more kind of positive relationships maybe between pupils and teachers, etc. And then the disadvantages is pupils become less prepared for working life because obviously in the world of work it is a formal environment, and obviously if you haven't been to a formal schooling environment then you would be less prepared for that. Also, the hidden curriculum is needed to create social cohesion in terms of everyone being aware of what the norms and values are, reducing enemy in society, ensuring social control, ensuring people understand the concept of sanctions and follow the norms and values to ensure that we have consensus and stability in our society. Okay, there we go.